The C8 Corvette ZR1 is a lot of things. It's an incredible car to look at, it's one of the coolest cars in its price range, it's an insane performer, and honestly one of the best sounding cars out right now. And like Corvettes usually are, it's one of the best bangs for your buck. But what it's not is a supercar.
What?
And I'm tired of everyone calling it that.
I am C8 Hunt and you're watching Instagram.
It's not really everyone calling the new ZR1 a supercar, but it's the same kind of crowd that calls a GT3 RS a supercar, the same people that call a Viper ACR a supercar, and the ZR1 does have a flat plane V8, very exotic aesthetics, more horsepower than most supercars, and an even higher top speed than most hypercars. And the performance of a ZR1 has been compared to that of a supercar since the C6 generation. Top Gear compared the C6 ZR1 to supercars on track and in a straight line. You can watch a C7 ZR1 walk down a supercharged Huracan on YouTube. And while the new ZR1 isn't exactly out yet, it looks like from the numbers that Chevy has posted that it's going to apply a lot of pressure to a lot of the supercar manufacturers that are relying on hybrid power to get anywhere close to the amount of horsepower that they're pushing out of that thing. So why isn't it a supercar? I guess the definition of the term supercar is quite subjective, but if it's so subjective, then why do so many enthusiasts use that term to describe a certain type of car? And why does everyone involved in the conversation have a similar idea in their head about what makes a supercar? Why are some cars indisputably supercars when other cars that are objectively better performers in this weird gray area? I think we can find the answers to all this if we just take a step back and think about what a supercar really is. When I was a kid and I was just getting into cars in the 2000s, I was more so into American muscle. In my early days, I had no clue what a Porsche was. I thought BMWs were ugly and I was obsessed with Mustangs, Camaros, and Challengers, but not Chargers, because the one that was out at the time, I think we can all agree was the ugliest generation of Charger, and it still is to this day. Like, even the Fox body looking one from the 80s looks better than this one in my opinion. But in second grade, so like 2008, I came across this book in the library called Hot Cars, Cool Rides. It was a short picture book about all the recession-rich cars that I'd never heard of before. It included some icons like the Ford GT, the Viper, the F430, and some cars you've never heard of before like the quad turbocharged V12 Chrysler Me 412 concept that had the potential to change Chrysler's trajectory but ultimately fell apart with the Daimler Chrysler split. It's crazy how everyone has their own story about like what turned them into a car person for real, and my generation usually has some combination of Pimp My Ride, Need for Speed, music videos, or Gran Turismo on PS2 and PS3, but I was never really that into racing video games until I was in like middle school. Let me know how y'all got into cars in the comments. But back when I was in like 4th grade, so like 2010, I got a 4th gen iPod Touch for Christmas. One of the earliest apps that I ever downloaded amongst Angry Birds and Cut the Rope was this app that, like, I can't even remember the name of it, but it was just a directory of exotic cars that I'd never heard of before. By this time I was already aware of the icons like the Lamborghinis and the Ferraris of the 2000s, but this app put me onto the Bugatti Veyron, the Faster SSC Ultimate Aero, the Tremontana R. I bet y'all never heard of that one before. But through this app, that was the first time I'd ever heard the term supercar. So naturally I wondered what the term supercar actually meant. Somewhere on the internet, I found that it was a car that went 200 miles per hour and from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds or less. And back then that was okay because not a lot of cars were doing 4-second 0 to 60s, and out of the ones that could, not a whole lot of those were going 200 miles an hour. I mean, the only cars that were capable of these types of numbers back then were the cars you think of when you think 2000 supercar. Gallardos, Murcielagos, 599s, 430s, the SLR McLaren, Carrera GT, the Koenigsegg CC models, the MC20, the Enzo, and a few more probably come to mind. But after a while, regular cars that you wouldn't really consider exotic started to get fast, like really fast. The M5 was going 200 miles an hour. The S197 facelift GT500 was the first muscle car of the modern era to hit 200 miles an hour. And that had a 0 to 60 time of 4 seconds. So that means the GT500 is a supercar, right? Hell no. Not even the new one. Even when it's the highest end version of the Mustang with a 6-figure price tag and performance that results in lap times that are sometimes faster than other supercars. You see how odd that sounds to call a Mustang a supercar? See, this is the problem with having a rigid threshold that's defined by numbers on a paper. Because now the standards for performance have moved way past what they were 10 to 15 years ago. If Ferrari drops a car today and it has a 3.5 second 0 to 60, that's considered underwhelming and a waste of money for what they're probably going to charge for it. Even the Ferrari SUV goes from 0 to 60 faster than that. So what? Do we say now that a supercar has to go from 0 to 60 in less than 3 seconds? Do we say that it has to reach a top speed of 220 miles an hour? Well, then by those standards, a Huracan STO isn't a supercar, an 812 Superfast isn't a supercar, but a Corvette is? Even if we say that a supercar should have more well-rounded performance figures, and we set the threshold with a sub 6-minute Nürburgring lap time, and using the Nürburgring is already an arbitrary standard, then what? The 488 Pista isn't a supercar, the 720S isn't a supercar, but a GT3 is, an AMG GT Black Series is, and not to mention, more money and a positive attitude can make anything faster around a track. It can make anything faster in a straight line. We just found out a Subaru WRX did a 6-minute 57-second Nürburgring lap time. But that's expected when you give it 300 more horsepower, rev it out to 8,500 RPMs, and change literally everything about the car. Now don't get me wrong. Just because I think that the consensus among some people, as well as my former understanding of what a supercar was, is wrong, doesn't mean that the definition is completely fluid and that a supercar is whatever you want it to be just because you like a certain car. I like the 911 GT3. It's faster than a lot of supercars around track, but that does not make it a supercar just because I really like it and it puts up good performance numbers. I think we can still use performance metrics as a mean to define a supercar, but we have to go by percentiles rather than coming up with arbitrary numbers that just sound good or are considered fast for the time. That way, when we use this method, the numbers will still change over time, but the threshold remains constant. It's like how Mensa decides who is a genius and who isn't. It's not about exact IQ numbers, because if the average level of intelligence increases or decreases over the decades and reflects on the average IQ level, then it could mean that either nobody is a genius or everybody is. But when you consider intelligence relative to the population, it puts things into perspective, which is why, contrary to popular belief, you don't have to score higher than a fixed requirement on a standardized intelligence test. You have to score within the top 2% of the population at the time. And before we get into what a supercar is, let's talk about what a supercar isn't. If you aren't aware, I came from TikTok, where the automotive commentary community over there has discussed this topic quite a lot. Between Paulie Nino, Trey Bugatti, myself, and others, we discussed through multiple videos what a supercar is and what a supercar isn't. It isn't a supercar because it has 1,000 horsepower or whatever number sounds nice in your head, or even because of top speed or acceleration or how fast it goes around a track. It isn't a supercar because it looks exotic. It isn't a supercar because it sounds exotic. And it certainly isn't a supercar because the doors go up. And stop calling them Lambo doors. Lamborghini isn't the only car company to offer vertical doors. They don't even put vertical doors on all their cars. There are multiple kinds of vertical doors, and that's a whole nother video within itself. But we can define a supercar with certain standards that allow for adjustment over time without setting unrealistic and or arbitrary standards. A supercar should fall within the top 1% of cars regarding performance standards such as horsepower, torque, speed, acceleration, and other handling metrics. And if a car falls within that margin at its debut, then it gets grandfathered in after it falls outside of it. A Ferrari 360 is getting gapped and outlapped by pretty much every M car of today. But I think for what it represented in its time, it still deserves supercar status. Likewise with the Mercy and many other supercars of its time. I don't think anyone looks back at a Countach or an Enzo and goes, I don't think that's a supercar anymore. A supercar should most definitely be exotic. And while that is extremely subjective, I think the mass consensus of what looks and sounds exotic is roughly the same. And there's certainly a mass consensus, and I think that consensus prioritizes looks over sound. This is exotic, this is not. This is exotic, this is not. Can we all agree? A GTR is not exotic. And just because a car is exotic does not mean that it's a supercar. A Lotus Emira is a great example of this, and Aston Martin Vantage is a great example of this. A car has to have both performance and an exotic presence to be considered a supercar, because sure, we can say a Tesla Model S Plaid can gap most supercars from a dig, but come on, be serious. A C8 Corvette Stingray also looks quite exotic, but come on, be serious. And so you're probably on the other side of the screen right now thinking, the C8 ZR1 has satisfied every single condition that you set for what makes a supercar. So why is it not a supercar? Keep watching, because I'm gonna explain myself entirely. It's gonna make sense in the end, I promise. I think it was Paulie Nino that brought up the idea that a supercar has to be expensive, but I think that rule is a bit arbitrary and kind of goes without saying, to be honest. If we say a car has to cost more than, I don't know, $300,000 to be a supercar, some of the supercars of the past, even adjusted for inflation, wouldn't have had an MSRP of that much. Also, the idea that a supercar has to be expensive just comes from the fact that to develop a car that falls within the top 1% of performance for its time is gonna cost significantly more money than it does to develop a Tahoe. And then with a smaller market, you have to price it in a way that covers the R&D when dispersed across a small fraction of the customers of a car you consider regular traffic. There are probably 100,000 G80 M3s out there, and it hasn't even run its full production cycle. The Lamborghini Huracan was Lamborghini's best-selling supercar ever, might actually be the best-selling supercar of all time, but they only sold 20,000 examples, including all the different trims and all the different limited editions over the course of 10 years. They made about half as many Aventadors, less than half of that for Mercies, way less Diablos, and even less Countaches. If the base model with no special trim, no special limited run edition is not a supercar, then the rest of the lineage is not a supercar. Well, the GT3 RS is a supercar. No, it's not. All supercars are sports cars, but not all sports cars are supercars. It's like squares and rectangles. If you want to live in an imaginary world where a GT3 RS is a supercar, then I guess go ahead. And by that logic, the C8 ZR1 is also a supercar. But I don't even think Porsche would claim that the GT3 RS is a supercar, and that's kind of my point here. You wouldn't call a base 911 Carrera a supercar, so why when you give it an engine swap, you give it some aero, and you give it a suspension, does it all of a sudden become a a supercar. The same logic can be applied to a Dodge Viper and the Viper ACR, C8 Stingray, the Z06 and the ZR1, the Cayman and the GT4 RS, and a bunch more cars that offer supercar-like performance, but when it comes down to it, are sports cars with some very good aero and maybe a different engine. A Ferrari 458 Italia in its base form, no special trim, no special aero, no special options, is still undeniably a supercar, so of course the 458 Speciale would be as well. Some die-hard Corvette boomers might go out on a limb and say that their C8 Stingray is a supercar because it's mid-engine. The Vet has always been front mid-engine, or at least from the C4 generation. And there are many mid-engine sports cars out there. Some of those sports cars are better sports cars than the Vet, and we don't even consider those for this kind of conversation of is it a supercar or not, and that's okay. If we consider the ZR1 or the Z06 for that matter a supercar, then you have to compare them to cars that in all honesty are above their weight class. I think calling these really extreme sports cars supercars dilutes the definition of a supercar just to satisfy certain fandoms, and it also dilutes the Corvette brand. The Corvette has always been the more affordable alternative to a Porsche or Ferrari that's easier to work on and it's more palatable for the everyman. And that was the entire point, and that's okay. Not everything has to be called a supercar or a hypercar. A lot of cool cars out there are not supercars and are not hypercars. There are cars out there that I like way more than most supercars that are not supercars. Do I call it a supercar because I think it offers a more enjoyable driving experience? No. The Corvettes have always offered an incredible value, even compared to the Viper, which really wasn't even competing against the Corvette. The cheapest third-gen Viper started at like 90, when you could really get a C7 Vet for not much more than 50K. And let's be honest, you really did need to come Z06 or better if you wanted to compare a C7 Vet to even a base Viper. Also, being a sports car usually means it's more comfortable, it's more practical, it's more usable on a daily basis, and if you break something, you aren't shitting bricks because a part costs $15,000, is on back order, and won't ship from Europe until 6 months from now. Yeah, I know, rich people problems, but I literally know someone who broke apart while doing some exhaust work on a Ferrari and the car wasn't drivable for 3 months. This simply wouldn't be an issue with the Corvette. I mean, we literally just saw Social Orbit get in an accident with his Z06, and that kind of accident might have totaled out a Ferrari, not gonna lie. But as he kept getting updates from his insurance company, they ended up not totaling it out. Go check out the entire story on his YouTube channel, but I'm quite sure he said his mechanic was able to get all the parts within like a couple of weeks. Matter of fact, a friend of a friend just bought a Ferrari F8 in Alabama, and literally his closest Ferrari dealership is in Atlanta, Georgia. And the reason I say if the base car isn't a supercar, it's not a supercar, is because supercars are generally pretty purpose built from the ground up, and that starts at the chassis. Like, unless it's a Bugatti, which is meant to also be very luxurious, these cars are usually pretty light. But hear me out, because the Corvette does not have a supercar level chassis. This car weighs almost 4,000 pounds in the ZR1 configuration. Why is the highest end car the heaviest one in the lineup? This is not commonplace for supercars. When this does happen with a supercar, it gains less than 100 pounds and is usually just because of the aero. If the Corvette was such a supercar, the C8 Stingray would not be the lightest one in the lineup. For reference, a McLaren 765 LT weighs less than 3,000 pounds, and even an Artura with a big battery and an electric motor weighs 3,300 pounds, which isn't much more than a 720S with a bigger engine. You see that weight difference between an Artura even and a ZR1? That's the same kind of weight difference you get when comparing a G80 M3 X-Drive to a Dodge Hellcat. And y'all are picking at Dodge owners for driving boats. Were y'all not? And I know y'all are probably like, well, the McLarens are more expensive. I know, they're supercars. You see what I'm saying? You don't get a big, wide, long chassis with a nice full interior and a twin turbo V8 to be within 500 pounds of a Miata without a supercar budget. A supercar R&D budget results in a lighter car, and this wouldn't be a surprise if you weren't drinking the Corvette as a supercar Kool-Aid, because you would know that the C8 Stingray already weighs 3,600 pounds in its base form. So what did you think was gonna happen when you added two big Betty Crocker 76mm Berg Warner turbos, remove the trunk lining which was previously filled with air on the Z06 and fill it with a fat heat exchanger, then fill the rest of the engine bay with all the piping and other cooling required when you put a turbo system on an engine? It weighs 4,000 pounds because it has 15 radiators and heat exchangers. Whereas McLaren, for example, figured out how to get the job done with 4 in the 720S 7 years ago, while the Corvette still had a pushrod motor based on the same architecture they've been using since forever, because that's the difference between a sports car and a supercar. But like I said, I don't think calling the ZR1 a sports car is a bad thing. It's one of the best sports cars out right now, and it's shaping up to be potentially one of the best sports cars of all time. While I don't think any of the C8s are quite the 458 alternative that people hyped it up to be, it's cool to see more variety on the market when shopping for a flat plane V8, as they are far and few between. Wait, few and far between. I seriously think this new ZR1 is going to be on the same level as the GT4 RS, which is already an incredible sports car. What the Corvette gains in weight over the 4RS, it also gains in horsepower, resulting in a better power to weight ratio. We know the car is going to have a top speed of 233 miles an hour, but I'm interested to see what it does on the track. The Z06 already put down a really low 7-minute time at the ring, so at the very least we can expect the ZR1 to shave off some time down the straights with more than 300 extra horses and easily put down a sub 6-minute lap time. Personally, I still think the Z06 is the new Corvette to have. On an unlimited budget where I can have any Corvette I want, I still think I'm going to go with either a C8 Z06, a C6 Z06, or maybe some crazy high-end custom C2 LS7 build, because I really like the C2 body style. That thing is sexy as hell. And I just love really high revving naturally aspirated V8s, which is why I'm fiending after an E92 M3, but I think the C8 Z06 is honestly the best American sports car of all time. I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but I think I'd take a Z06 over a Viper, and I haven't been in a Viper in a long time, and I actually haven't been in a C8 in a minute, so maybe I need a refresher, but of the current Corvette lineup, the Z06 is my choice for sure. That being said, the ZR1 will probably be the objectively better performer by most metrics, and we'll never see a Corvette like this ever again. It'll be the most powerful Corvette of all time that doesn't have an electric engine. And like I said, it's definitely shaping up to be one of the best sports cars, if not the best American sports car of all time.